Officer Mark Hayes was on his usual patrol in a suburban neighborhood when he noticed something strange in the middle of the street. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows, and everything seemed normal until he saw what appeared to be an animal lying motionless in the road. At first, Officer Hayes assumed it was just a fallen leaf or some discarded trash, but as he approached, he realized it was a small, injured animal. He pulled over to the side of the street and got out of his patrol car, his instincts kicking in as he moved closer. He could see the creature was a squirrel, and it was twitching slightly, but otherwise appeared to be in distress. The officer knelt down to get a better look at the animal, concerned that it might have been hit by a car. However, as he gently moved the squirrel to check for injuries, he noticed that its body didn't have any obvious signs of being struck. The squirrel's limbs weren't broken, but it still seemed weak and uncoordinated. Officer Hayes carefully cradled the squirrel in his hands, trying to assess the situation further. That's when he saw something that immediately alarmed him, a large, bulging lump on the animal's back, something that looked far from natural. The lump appeared to be growing beneath the squirrel's fur, prompting the officer to suspect something far more serious than a mere accident. Officer Hayes was no stranger to the many wild animals that roamed the suburban area he patrolled, but what he was witnessing now was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The lump on the squirrel's back wasn't just a wound or a simple injury, it seemed alive. The officer's first thought was that the squirrel had some kind of parasite, but he hadn't seen anything quite like this before. He immediately examined the area more closely, his heart sinking when he realized that the lump was moving. As his fingers brushed against the squirrel's fur, he felt the telltale signs of a botfly infestation. The officer had read about botflies in veterinary reports, but had never personally encountered an animal suffering from such an infestation. Botflies are parasites that lay their eggs under the skin of mammals, and the larvae burrow in, feeding on the animal's flesh as they grow. The officer's knowledge of wildlife and his concern for the animal's welfare made him act quickly. He knew the squirrel was in pain and could suffer severe complications if the larvae weren't removed soon. It was clear that immediate action was needed, and the officer knew he couldn't handle the situation on his own. Not wanting to take any chances, he decided to get the squirrel to a wildlife rehabilitation center, where trained experts could provide the necessary care and save the animal's life. With a sense of urgency, he picked up the injured squirrel and gently placed it in the car, hoping that he wasn't too late. As Officer Hayes drove toward the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, his mind raced. He had seen animals in distress before, but this was a different kind of emergency. He was accustomed to responding to car accidents and minor injuries, but dealing with an animal suffering from a parasitic infestation was something entirely new. The officer drove with caution, mindful of the squirrel's fragile state as it lay in his lap. He had a deep respect for nature and understood the important role wild animals played in the ecosystem, so the thought of the little squirrel suffering was enough to drive him to act quickly. The short drive felt longer than it really was as he concentrated on getting the squirrel to safety. Along the way, the officer kept an eye on the animal, noticing that it seemed weaker and more lethargic by the minute. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt that he hadn't noticed the squirrel's condition sooner. However, he quickly reminded himself that he was doing the right thing by seeking professional help. Upon arriving at the rehabilitation center, he hurried inside with the squirrel in his arms, anxious for the staff to begin their treatment. The center had a well-established reputation for rescuing and rehabilitating injured wildlife, and he knew that the squirrel would be in good hands there. He hoped that the swift action he had taken would give the little animal the best chance at survival. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was a short distance away, nestled in the heart of the city's park system. It specialized in treating injured and sick wildlife, and it was known for its quick response times and effective treatments. Officer Hayes was greeted by the receptionist, who immediately saw the squirrel in his arms and ushered him to the back for examination. Within moments, the lead veterinarian, Dr. Susan Garcia, arrived to assess the situation. Dr. Garcia had been working at the center for years and had encountered all sorts of animal ailments, but this particular case was rare even for her. She took one look at the squirrel and immediately recognized the symptoms of a botfly infestation. "Poor thing," Dr. Garcia said softly, gently taking the squirrel from Officer Hayes. She examined the lump carefully and explained that the larvae would need to be removed quickly, as they could cause serious infections and even death if left untreated. Officer Hayes was clearly concerned, but he trusted the doctor's expertise and was relieved that the squirrel was now in capable hands. Dr. Garcia reassured the officer that they would do everything they could to help the animal. "We've handled worse cases," she said, "but this little one is lucky you found it in time." Officer Hayes, grateful for her calm and professional demeanor, stepped back, allowing the veterinarian to begin the procedure. As Dr. Garcia began the delicate procedure of removing the botfly larvae from the squirrel's back, Officer Hayes stood by, watching with a mix of concern and admiration. The doctor had explained that botflies are notorious for infesting wild animals, particularly rodents, and can be difficult to remove without causing harm. The larvae burrow deep into the animal's skin, and extracting them requires a steady hand and expertise. The officer stood in silence, knowing that this little squirrel's life depended on the precision of Dr. Garcia's actions. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the doctor's calm focus as she worked to save the animal. The process was slow and methodical, with Dr. Garcia carefully using small tools to extract each larvae. The squirrel was clearly in discomfort, but thanks to the staff's expertise, the extraction was going smoothly. The officer felt a sense of relief as he watched the team carefully remove the parasites one by one, knowing that each larvae removed meant one less threat to the squirrel's health. Dr. Garcia continued to reassure him, explaining that while the process was tedious, it was necessary to ensure the squirrel's full recovery. Once all of the larvae had been removed, the officer let out a small sigh of relief, knowing that the worst part was over for the squirrel. After the larvae were removed, Dr. Garcia examined the squirrel closely to ensure there were no remaining signs of infection. The officer watched as she worked, her gentle touch and expertise putting his mind at ease. He couldn't believe how much care was required to treat something as small and seemingly insignificant as a squirrel, but the doctor had made it clear that every step was vital. The squirrel's tiny body had been through so much, and Officer Hayes felt a deep sense of empathy for the animal. He wasn't sure how long it would take for the little creature to fully recover, but he knew that the rehabilitation center was doing everything in its power to help it heal. Once the squirrel had been thoroughly checked for any lingering health concerns, the staff began administering fluids to rehydrate it. The officer learned that dehydration was a common issue for animals suffering from botfly infestations, and it was important to stabilize their condition before any other treatment could be done. As he sat quietly in the corner, Officer Hayes reflected on how fortunate the squirrel was to have been found and treated so quickly. He had learned that wildlife rehabilitation was not just about medical procedures, but also about giving animals the time and care they needed to heal emotionally and physically. The officer was now more committed than ever to ensuring that wildlife was treated with the compassion and respect it deserved. The rehabilitation center staff worked tirelessly over the next few hours to stabilize the squirrel, and Officer Hayes was kept informed of its condition. Despite the trauma it had endured, the little animal was surprisingly resilient. The officer spent a few hours at the center, checking in on the squirrel's progress and talking to Dr. Garcia about its prognosis. The staff explained that, while the botfly infestation was serious, the squirrel's chances of survival were good thanks to the quick intervention. Officer Hayes, feeling both relief and a sense of accomplishment, was ready to leave, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the squirrel's side just yet. He watched as the staff carefully placed the squirrel in a recovery habitat where it could rest and regain its strength. The officer was impressed by the rehabilitation center's resources and dedication. The staff were experienced and knowledgeable, but what really struck him was their genuine love for the animals they cared for. The center's volunteers and veterinarians weren't just professionals. They were deeply invested in the well-being of every creature they treated. The officer reflected on the difference that such centers made in the lives of injured wildlife, and he was grateful that he had been able to contribute to the squirrel's rescue. Before he left, Dr. Garcia assured him that the squirrel would receive the best care and that it had a strong chance of making a full recovery. Still, the officer knew he would return to check on the squirrel's progress. He felt a connection to the little creature, and he wasn't about to abandon it now. The next few days were crucial for the squirrel's recovery. The center staff closely monitored its progress, ensuring that it was properly hydrated and well-fed. Officer Hayes, eager for updates, called the center every day to check on the squirrel's condition. He was happy to hear that the little animal was improving with each passing day. It was eating well and showing signs of regaining its energy. The officer even visited the center once to see the squirrel for himself, taking a moment to watch it move around its enclosure. It was clear that the squirrel was starting to feel more like itself, and its recovery gave the officer a deep sense of satisfaction. As the days went by, the officer learned more about the impact of botfly infestations on local wildlife. The rehabilitation center explained that while such parasites were common in many wild animals, they were often left untreated, leading to unnecessary suffering or death. Officer Hayes felt a growing sense of responsibility to help raise awareness about the issue. The experience had taught him just how important it was for people to look out for animals in distress and to know when to seek professional help. With the squirrel's recovery on track, the officer began to think about how he could help others in the future. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he encountered an animal in need. As the squirrel's health continued to improve, the rehabilitation center staff began to prepare for its eventual release back into the wild. Officer Hayes was informed that the squirrel would soon be strong enough to return to its natural habitat, and he was invited to take part in the release process. The officer felt both excited and bittersweet about the idea of the squirrel leaving the center. He had grown attached to the little animal, and the thought of seeing it return to the wild made him feel both proud and nostalgic. He knew that the squirrel's story would stay with him for a long time, as it had left a lasting impact on his perspective about the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. On the day of the release, Officer Hayes arrived at the center early in the morning, excited to be part of the final chapter of the squirrel's journey. He was greeted by the rehabilitation staff, who had prepared the squirrel for its return to the wild. The officer watched as the staff carefully carried the small animal to a patch of trees near the edge of the forest. They opened the carrier, and the squirrel hesitated for a moment, as if taking in the sights and sounds of its surroundings. Then, with a burst of energy, it dashed off into the woods, its tail flicking behind it as it disappeared into the trees. Officer Hayes smiled, knowing that the squirrel was now free and healthy, thanks to the collective effort of so many people. After the release, Officer Hayes stood quietly at the edge of the forest, watching as the squirrel disappeared into the underbrush. There was a sense of completion, and though the little creature was now gone, the officer felt a sense of pride. He had not only saved an animal's life, but had also witnessed its return to the wild, where it belonged. The squirrel's journey was a reminder of the delicate balance between humans and nature, and Officer Hayes realized that his job as a law enforcement officer extended beyond just protecting people. This experience had shown him how essential it was to protect the creatures that shared the world with us. 2. As he walked back to his patrol car, Officer Hayes reflected on how much he had learned from this unexpected encounter. It had started as a simple traffic stop but turned into a lesson in compassion, resilience, and the importance of wildlife conservation. He had always known about the critical work done by wildlife rehabbers, but now, having witnessed it firsthand, he had a new sense of respect and appreciation for those who dedicated their lives to helping animals. The officer's heart swelled with emotion as he thought about the small squirrel, now free, thanks to the collective effort of people who cared. The news of Officer Hayes' rescue of the squirrel spread quickly around the community. It wasn't long before local news stations picked up the story, calling the officer a hero for his quick thinking and dedication to saving the squirrel. Many people in the neighborhood were touched by the story, and some even visited the rehabilitation center to learn more about how they could help wildlife in their own backyards. The story became a feel-good moment for the community, providing a sense of unity and a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can have a significant impact. The local Wildlife Rehabilitation Center also received an outpouring of support. Donations poured in, and more people became interested in volunteering their time to help with the center's efforts. Officer Hayes, while humbled by the attention, was quick to downplay his role in the story. He remained focused on the real heroes, Dr. Garcia and her team, who had performed the critical work of saving the squirrel. They, too, were grateful for the increased awareness and support from the community. The officer was content knowing that his actions had sparked a wider conversation about the importance of wildlife rescue and conservation. As weeks passed, Officer Hayes began to notice more people in the neighborhood taking steps to care for local wildlife. Some put out bird feeders, while others made sure to leave extra food and water out for squirrels, birds, and other small creatures. It was clear that the squirrel story had ignited a spark in the community, making people more aware of the needs of the animals around them. Officer Hayes was pleased to see how much impact a single act of kindness could have. It wasn't just about saving one squirrel, it was about creating a ripple effect of compassion that spread throughout the neighborhood. Feeling inspired, Officer Hayes decided to visit the local school to talk to children about the importance of respecting and protecting wildlife. He shared the story of the squirrel and how a simple act of kindness could change an animal's life. The children listened intently, and many of them expressed interest in volunteering at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center or starting their own conservation efforts. It was clear that the story had made a lasting impression on the younger generation, and Officer Hayes felt proud to have played a small part in shaping their understanding of nature and the need for wildlife preservation. A few months later, Officer Hayes received a letter from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. It was a thank you note for his quick thinking and for bringing the squirrel in when he did. The letter also included an update on the squirrel's progress. The animal had made a full recovery and had been spotted in the wild several times, thriving in its natural habitat. The officer felt an overwhelming sense of joy as he read the letter, knowing that the squirrel was living its best life, free from the parasitic burden that had once threatened its survival. The letter also included a photograph of the squirrel, taken during one of its recent sightings. In the photo, the little animal was perched high on a tree branch, its tail flicking in the breeze as it looked out over the forest. It was a sight that filled Officer Hayes with a deep sense of fulfillment. In that moment, he realized that his actions had truly made a difference, not just for the squirrel, but for the entire ecosystem. He had helped ensure that one small creature could live to play its part in the world, and that was a reward more valuable than any recognition or praise. The experience with the squirrel stayed with Officer Hayes long after the story had faded from the headlines. It became a regular topic of conversation with his colleagues, who would often ask about the squirrel's recovery and the impact it had on the community. The officer shared his story with anyone who would listen, reminding them that small acts of kindness could have far-reaching consequences. He also made sure to advocate for wildlife rescue organizations, encouraging others to get involved and support these essential services. His passion for protecting animals had deepened, and he became a vocal advocate for wildlife conservation. One day, during a routine patrol, Officer Hayes spotted a bird caught in a fence. It was a simple incident, but it reminded him of the squirrel's rescue. Without hesitation, he sprang into action, carefully freeing the bird and making sure it was unharmed. The act was small, but it felt significant. Officer Hayes realized that his duty as a protector wasn't limited to human life. It extended to all living creatures. He knew that he would continue to serve as both a law enforcement officer and a guardian of the animals, keeping a watchful eye out for those in need, no matter how big or small. Over time, Officer Hayes became known in the community as the wildlife cop. His rescue of the squirrel had earned him a reputation as someone who was always ready to lend a hand to animals in distress. People would often stop him while he was on patrol to ask for advice on how to help injured or sick wildlife. Officer Hayes was always willing to share his knowledge, and he encouraged others to get involved in local conservation efforts. He was pleased to see that his small act of kindness had sparked a larger movement of compassion for animals, and he was happy to be a part of it. One day, a local news station reached out to Officer Hayes for an interview, wanting to know more about his experiences with wildlife rescue. The officer agreed, sharing his story of the squirrel and the lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke about the importance of wildlife conservation, how even the smallest acts of kindness could make a difference, and the role of communities in protecting the natural world. The interview was well received, and it inspired even more people to take action in support of wildlife. Officer Hayes was humbled by the attention but was most proud of the lasting impact his story had on the community's attitude toward animals and their welfare. Officer Hayes was invited to speak at a local community event focused on wildlife conservation. The event, organized by a group of local environmentalists, was aimed at raising awareness about the importance of protecting wildlife and their habitats. Officer Hayes shared his experience with the squirrel and explained how everyone had a role to play in preserving the natural world. He spoke passionately about the need for quick intervention in cases of animal distress and encouraged attendees to get involved with local wildlife rescue organizations. The officer's speech was well received, and many attendees approached him afterward to thank him for his efforts. Some expressed interest in volunteering at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, while others offered donations to support the cause. Officer Hayes felt a sense of pride knowing that he had inspired so many people to take action. The event marked a turning point for him, as he realized that his role as a protector of animals could extend far beyond his work as a police officer. He was now a key figure in the community's conservation efforts, and he vowed to continue working toward a future where wildlife would always have advocates fighting for their well-being. As the months went by, Officer Hayes kept in touch with Dr. Garcia and the staff at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. He regularly checked in on the center's progress, learning more about their efforts and how he could help. The officer became an unofficial ambassador for the center, spreading the word about the important work being done to rescue and rehabilitate wildlife. In recognition of his contributions, the center invited him to serve on their advisory board, a role that would allow him to help guide the center's efforts and ensure its continued success. With a deep sense of gratitude, Officer Hayes accepted the invitation, knowing that he was in a unique position to help. His experience with the squirrel had opened his eyes to the world of wildlife conservation, and he was determined to do everything he could to support the cause. The officer's involvement in the center grew over time, and he became a regular presence at fundraising events, volunteering his time and using his platform to raise awareness. His passion for protecting wildlife had become a central part of his life, and he felt fulfilled knowing that he was making a difference in ways he never could have imagined. 1 year after Officer Hayes' heroic rescue of the squirrel, a wildlife charity event was held to honor those who had contributed to wildlife protection in the community. The event, which was held at a local park, featured talks from conservationists, environmentalists, and people like Officer Hayes who had made a difference. The officer was invited as a guest of honor, and he was asked to give a speech about his experiences. As he stood in front of a crowd of passionate wildlife advocates, he reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day when he saved the squirrel. What had started as an isolated incident had turned into a movement of awareness and action, and Officer Hayes couldn't have been more proud. During his speech, Officer Hayes spoke about the importance of community involvement in wildlife conservation. He shared stories of how small actions, like keeping an eye out for injured animals or supporting local rehabilitation centers, could have a huge impact. He also highlighted the role of education in protecting wildlife, encouraging people to learn about the creatures that lived around them and how they could help. The crowd was moved by his words, and several people came forward to express their gratitude for his dedication to the cause. It was a moment of recognition not only for Officer Hayes, but for everyone who had contributed to the growing movement of wildlife conservation. After the charity event, Officer Hayes was approached by a local wildlife documentary filmmaker who was interested in creating a short film about his experience with the squirrel and the subsequent impact it had on the community. The filmmaker wanted to showcase how one small act of kindness had ripple effects, inspiring people to get involved in wildlife protection. Officer Hayes was initially hesitant but ultimately agreed, knowing that the film could help raise even more awareness about the importance of animal rescue and conservation efforts. Filming began in the spring, and Officer Hayes worked closely with a filmmaker to tell the story of the squirrel's rescue. The crew spent several weeks following Officer Hayes as he interacted with community members, visited the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and shared his experiences. The documentary also included interviews with Dr. Garcia and other key figures in the wildlife conservation community, providing a deeper look into the work being done to help injured and sick animals. The finished product was a heartwarming and inspiring film that captured the power of compassion and the importance of protecting the natural world. The documentary, titled Saving a Squirrel: The Ripple Effect of Compassion, premiered at a local theater and was met with widespread acclaim. The film resonated deeply with audiences, many of whom had never considered the impact they could have on wildlife before. After the premiere, several schools reached out to Officer Hayes, asking him to speak to students about the importance of wildlife conservation. He was invited to several classrooms, where he shared the story of the squirrel, the challenges faced by wildlife, and how even young people could get involved in helping animals. Officer Hayes was thrilled to see the next generation of conservationists inspired by his story, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose in his efforts to spread awareness. The documentary also attracted the attention of larger wildlife organizations, and Officer Hayes was invited to participate in panel discussions and conferences about wildlife protection. His story had gone beyond the local community, touching the hearts of people from all over the country. He was humbled by the response, but remained focused on his mission to continue raising awareness, educating others, and supporting wildlife rescue efforts in any way he could. The officer knew that his journey had just begun, and he was excited for the future and the new opportunities to make a difference. As Officer Hayes continued his advocacy for wildlife conservation, he began to see more tangible results in his community. Local businesses started to sponsor wildlife rehabilitation efforts, and schools began offering programs on environmental education. People were more aware of the importance of protecting wildlife habitats, and some even began to create wildlife-friendly spaces in their own backyards. The officer was proud to see how much had changed, knowing that it all started with his decision to rescue that one squirrel. One day, while on patrol, Officer Hayes stopped to assist a woman who had reported a deer stuck in a fence. The woman had heard about his work with wildlife and knew he was the right person to call. Officer Hayes quickly assessed the situation and carefully freed the deer, ensuring it was unharmed before it ran back into the woods. The woman thanked him, and Officer Hayes couldn't help but smile, knowing that his reputation as a wildlife protector had made a difference. He had once again been able to help an animal in need, and this time, it felt even more fulfilling than before. Officer Hayes was invited to attend a national conference on wildlife rescue and conservation. The conference, held in Washington, D.C., brought together experts, activists, and law enforcement officers from all over the country to discuss the future of wildlife protection. Officer Hayes was honored to be included in such a prestigious event, and he was eager to learn from others who had been working in the field of conservation for much longer than he had. During the conference, he shared his story and participated in discussions about how law enforcement could play a more active role in wildlife rescue efforts. The conference proved to be a turning point for Officer Hayes. He left with new ideas, strategies, and a renewed sense of purpose. He also forged new connections with wildlife organizations and professionals who offered him valuable advice on how to further his work in the community. Officer Hayes returned home with a wealth of knowledge and a determination to continue advocating for wildlife protection. His work was far from over, and he knew that he could make an even greater impact with the support and guidance of others in the field. Back in his community, Officer Hayes was determined to implement the new ideas he had learned at the conference. He worked with local law enforcement to establish a wildlife protection program, which included training officers on how to respond to animal rescue calls and how to handle situations involving injured or distressed wildlife. The program also aimed to raise awareness in the community about the importance of wildlife protection and to encourage residents to report any instances of animal cruelty or neglect. The program was a huge success, and it helped solidify Officer Hayes' role as a key figure in the community's efforts to protect wildlife. As a result of the program, more animals were being rescued and more people were actively involved in conservation efforts. Officer Hayes saw firsthand how much of a difference education and awareness could make. He was proud of the progress the community had made, and he knew that his work wasn't finished yet. There was still much to be done, but Officer Hayes felt confident that he was on the right path, and he was determined to continue his efforts to protect the animals he had come to care so deeply about. One day, while Officer Hayes was conducting his regular patrol, he received a call about a raccoon that had become stuck in a drainage pipe. The raccoon had been trapped for several hours and was in distress. Officer Hayes immediately responded to the call, knowing that time was of the essence. Upon arrival, he found the raccoon in a tight spot, but he carefully assessed the situation and devised a plan to rescue the animal. With the help of a local wildlife rescuer, Officer Hayes managed to free the raccoon without causing harm. The raccoon was taken to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for a checkup, and Officer Hayes received an update the next day. The raccoon was doing well and was expected to make a full recovery. Officer Hayes felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had once again been able to help an animal in need. It was another small victory, but to Officer Hayes, each rescue was a reminder of the importance of his work and the difference he was making in the world. Officer Hayes' work in wildlife conservation continued to inspire others, and his efforts were recognized by the mayor of the town. During a special ceremony, the mayor presented Officer Hayes with a commendation for his dedication to wildlife rescue and his contributions to the community's conservation efforts. The mayor praised Officer Hayes for his selflessness and for inspiring others to get involved in protecting animals. It was a proud moment for Officer Hayes, but he was quick to credit the entire community for their efforts in supporting wildlife conservation. The ceremony was attended by many of the people who had been part of the Wildlife Protection Program, including volunteers from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center and local businesses that had supported the cause. Officer Hayes felt a deep sense of gratitude for the collective effort that had been put into making the community a safer place for animals. As he accepted the commendation, he vowed to continue his work and to inspire others to follow in his footsteps. Officer Hayes knew that there was still much to be done, but he was more determined than ever to make a lasting impact on the world of wildlife conservation. As Officer Hayes continued his work, he started to realize that his role had expanded beyond just rescuing individual animals. He had become a symbol of hope for both wildlife and the people in his community. People began to reach out to him not only for assistance, but also for advice on how to better coexist with nature. He started organizing local seminars where he could teach the public about wildlife safety, the importance of protecting animal habitats, and how to handle situations involving injured or distressed wildlife. His talks were filled with passionate discussions, and he always emphasized the idea that small actions from individuals could make a massive difference in the lives of animals. The seminars quickly gained popularity, drawing large crowds of people eager to learn more about how they could contribute to wildlife conservation. Officer Hayes partnered with local environmental groups, bringing in experts to speak about sustainable living and the interconnectedness of human and wildlife well-being. These events had a lasting impact, and Officer Hayes began to see a shift in how people viewed their relationship with nature. No longer were they passive observers. They were active participants in protecting the world around them. Around this time, a local news outlet reached out to Officer Hayes for an in-depth interview about his work with wildlife and the impact it had on the community. The interview, which was featured on both television and online platforms, brought widespread attention to his efforts. Officer Hayes spoke candidly about his motivations, recalling the pivotal moment when he had rescued the squirrel from the bot fly infestation. He explained how that single experience had changed his outlook on his role as an officer, seeing himself not just as someone who upholds the law but also as a guardian of the natural world. He discussed the emotional connection he felt with the animals he helped, emphasizing that every life mattered. The interview sparked a nationwide conversation about wildlife conservation and the importance of having more officers involved in such efforts. Many viewers were inspired by Officer Hayes' story, and some law enforcement agencies even reached out to learn how they could integrate wildlife rescue training into their own protocols. Officer Hayes became a symbol of hope not just in his own town but across the country. His story became an example of how compassion and dedication could create lasting change. As the years passed, Officer Hayes continued to work tirelessly for wildlife. He often found himself faced with difficult and heartbreaking situations, such as responding to reports of poaching or illegal trapping. Each time, he felt a renewed sense of urgency to protect animals from harm. In response to these challenges, he worked alongside local government officials to implement stronger laws protecting wildlife. They advocated for harsher penalties for those who harmed animals and pushed for more funding for rehabilitation centers and conservation programs. His efforts were met with resistance at times, but Officer Hayes never wavered. One of the most rewarding moments came when the town passed a new ordinance that provided financial support for wildlife rescue operations and set up emergency response teams for wildlife-related incidents. The success of this initiative was a testament to the hard work and persistence of Officer Hayes and those who believed in his mission. With the support of the community and the local government, Officer Hayes felt more empowered than ever to continue his mission to save and protect wildlife. One afternoon, as Officer Hayes was walking through the park where the squirrel had been rescued, he spotted something unusual. A small group of children gathered around, holding up a bird that appeared to have a broken wing. Officer Hayes approached them and, after explaining the situation, gently took the bird into his hands. As he carefully examined the bird, he realized it was a species that was particularly vulnerable to extinction in their area. Officer Hayes contacted the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center immediately, and they advised him on the best course of action for the bird's care. What struck Officer Hayes was the way the children had instinctively gathered around to help the bird. They had learned about wildlife rescue from the seminars and had taken it upon themselves to help the animal. Officer Hayes was deeply moved by their actions. He spoke with them about how important it was to act quickly and carefully in such situations, emphasizing that their actions had already made a big difference. The experience reminded him that the future of wildlife conservation was in good hands, as long as the next generation continued to be educated and motivated to make a change. Officer Hayes' work had now become a full-fledged movement in his town, and the positive ripple effect was felt far and wide. His community was now seen as a model of how people could live in harmony with nature. The local school district had even implemented a mandatory wildlife education program for all students, teaching them the importance of wildlife preservation, environmental stewardship, and how to properly interact with animals. Officer Hayes visited schools regularly to talk to the students about the importance of compassion and the role they could play in protecting the world around them. The success of the wildlife education program was further demonstrated by the growing number of young people who were becoming actively involved in local conservation efforts. They volunteered at wildlife rehabilitation centers, assisted in habitat restoration projects, and participated in tree planting campaigns. Officer Hayes was proud to see his community take on such a strong, collective responsibility for the environment. As he stood at the head of one of his community seminars, he realized that the legacy of the squirrel rescue had become so much more than he could have ever imagined. It had sparked a movement, and the movement was growing stronger every day. The local news once again caught wind of Officer Hayes' efforts when they learned that the wildlife conservation program he had helped create was being adopted by other towns in the region. The news outlet did a feature on the growing trend of law enforcement officers engaging in wildlife protection, and Officer Hayes was once again in the spotlight. He received messages from people across the country who were inspired by his story and wanted to know how they could replicate his success in their own communities. Officer Hayes felt honored by the recognition but remained focused on his work, knowing that the journey was far from over. The feature helped bring even more attention to wildlife protection, and new partnerships were formed between local law enforcement agencies, conservationists, and environmental groups. Officer Hayes used this opportunity to push for greater collaboration between these groups, emphasizing that a unified effort was the best way to ensure lasting success in wildlife conservation. As he worked alongside others, it became clear that his vision was starting to take shape on a much larger scale. Officer Hayes' influence was beginning to extend far beyond the small town where he had started his journey. As Officer Hayes' work gained national attention, he began to receive invitations to speak at conferences and conventions focused on wildlife conservation. His first major speaking engagement was at an annual wildlife protection conference in Washington, D.C., where experts from around the world gathered to share ideas and strategies. Officer Hayes took to the stage, sharing his story of rescuing the squirrel and how it had sparked a community-wide movement. His humble approach and personal anecdotes resonated deeply with the audience, and he was met with standing applause. It was clear that his work had touched people far beyond his local community. In the months that followed, Officer Hayes became a sought-after speaker at various environmental events. He used these opportunities to advocate for wildlife education, the importance of law enforcement's role in conservation, and the need for stronger protections for endangered species. Each event allowed him to meet like-minded individuals who were equally passionate about saving the planet's wildlife. By connecting with these experts, Officer Hayes was able to learn more about global conservation challenges and bring that knowledge back to his town, where it was applied in innovative ways to improve local wildlife protection programs. One day, Officer Hayes received a call that would change the course of his career forever. A national wildlife organization reached out to him with an offer to collaborate on a nationwide wildlife rescue initiative. The organization had been following his work and admired how he had turned a small local rescue into a larger movement. They proposed creating a national network of officers trained to handle wildlife emergencies, something that had never been done before. The initiative would aim to expand the reach of wildlife rescue operations, promote education, and create a cohesive effort to protect endangered species across the country. Excited and honored by the opportunity, Officer Hayes eagerly accepted the offer. He began working with the organization to develop the training curriculum for law enforcement officers across the nation. It was a massive undertaking, but Officer Hayes felt that it was a natural next step in his journey. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the program would include not just technical training but also a strong focus on compassion and the emotional aspects of animal rescue. He wanted officers to not only know how to save an animal but to understand the profound impact their actions could have on the lives of these creatures and their communities. As the National Wildlife Rescue Initiative gained momentum, Officer Hayes began to see the tangible results of his hard work. Officers across the country were being trained in wildlife rescue, and new rescue operations were being launched in areas that had never had the resources or knowledge to handle such situations before. The initiative also included the establishment of a wildlife rescue hotline, allowing citizens to report injured or stranded animals in real time. This system ensured that help was always just a phone call away, and it led to a significant increase in the number of animals saved. One of the most rewarding outcomes of the initiative was the increased awareness it generated. People in communities that had previously been indifferent to wildlife conservation were now taking part in rescue efforts. Officer Hayes started receiving messages from citizens sharing their own rescue stories, reporting injured animals they had found, and expressing their gratitude for the training and resources provided by the program. The initiative had sparked a sense of collective responsibility that spread across the nation, and Officer Hayes couldn't have been prouder of the positive changes that were unfolding. Despite his growing success, Officer Hayes never lost sight of the importance of community involvement. He knew that while national initiatives were crucial, the success of wildlife rescue efforts ultimately depended on local communities. To that end, he continued to prioritize his outreach programs, ensuring that residents were not just passive recipients of the initiative but active participants in preserving wildlife. He encouraged people to get involved by volunteering with local wildlife organizations, educating their neighbors, and spreading awareness about the importance of coexisting with nature. One of the most successful community projects was the establishment of Wildlife Watch, a neighborhood group dedicated to monitoring local wildlife and reporting any issues. The group was composed of volunteers who were trained by Officer Hayes and his team to identify signs of distress in animals, whether it was due to injury, disease, or environmental factors. This grassroots initiative helped build a stronger connection between people and the wildlife in their area, and it empowered residents to take ownership of their local ecosystems. Officer Hayes was thrilled to see the community come together in such a meaningful way. Officer Hayes' personal life also began to reflect the profound impact his work was having. His family, initially skeptical about the amount of time he was dedicating to wildlife conservation, had started to see the positive effects on both his career and his well-being. They saw how deeply committed he was to his mission and how fulfilling it had become. His wife, who had always been supportive but hesitant about the long hours, became one of his biggest advocates. She helped organize fundraisers, volunteered at local wildlife rehabilitation centers, and even began attending the seminars with him. Together, they became a powerhouse duo in the fight for wildlife preservation. Their children, too, were influenced by their father's work. They spent weekends at the Wildlife Center, learning firsthand about animal care and conservation efforts. Officer Hayes made sure to balance his time with his family, knowing how important it was to share his passion with them. It wasn't long before his kids were volunteering at local events and speaking about wildlife protection to their classmates. The Hayes family had truly become a symbol of how a commitment to something greater than oneself could unite a family and inspire an entire community. As Officer Hayes' influence grew, he was asked to partner with major environmental organizations to create educational content about wildlife conservation. The goal was to create documentaries, online videos, and articles that would raise awareness about the challenges facing wildlife and the importance of taking action. Officer Hayes worked alongside filmmakers and environmental experts to produce content that was not only informative, but also emotionally engaging. He wanted to show people that the plight of wildlife wasn't just an issue for scientists and activists, it was an issue for everyone. The documentaries became an instant success, reaching millions of people around the world. They featured real-life rescue stories, including the squirrel that had been his first rescue, and highlighted the efforts of individuals and communities working together to protect wildlife. The content emphasized the emotional connection between people and animals, showing that everyone could play a part in making the world a better place for both humans and wildlife. Officer Hayes was humbled by the response, knowing that his work had inspired so many people to take action in their own lives. By now, Officer Hayes had become a household name in the world of wildlife conservation. He was invited to participate in global summits alongside world leaders, environmental scientists, and conservation advocates. His expertise and unique perspective as a law enforcement officer who had dedicated his life to protecting wildlife made him a sought-after speaker. He shared the story of the squirrel that had ignited his passion and emphasized how individuals could make a difference, regardless of their background or profession. At one of these summits, Officer Hayes was honored with an award for his outstanding contributions to wildlife conservation. The award recognized not only his individual efforts, but also the broader movement he had created. It was a proud moment for Officer Hayes, but he made sure to acknowledge the community that had supported him from the beginning. He knew that his work was far from over, but he was grateful for all the progress that had been made. He felt confident that the seeds of change had been planted and that they would continue to grow for generations to come. With his newfound platform, Officer Hayes was determined to make the most of the momentum he had built. He launched a nationwide campaign called Rescue for All, aimed at mobilizing more people to participate in wildlife protection efforts. This campaign encouraged citizens to get involved with local wildlife rescue groups, offer financial support to animal welfare organizations, and volunteer their time to educate others. Hayes knew that real change required a collective effort, and this initiative allowed him to connect individuals from all walks of life who shared his passion for conservation. The Rescue for All campaign quickly gained traction, with thousands of new volunteers signing up. Officer Hayes collaborated with wildlife centers, schools, and local businesses to create educational materials that were distributed nationwide. He was especially focused on teaching children the importance of treating animals with kindness and respect. The campaign also included a social media component, with participants sharing their own rescue stories, pictures of animals they helped, and information about wildlife-friendly practices. The initiative created a wave of support, and the sense of unity around it felt more powerful than anything Officer Hayes had experienced before. While the Rescue for All campaign was a major success, Officer Hayes knew that a lot of work still lay ahead. One of the next steps in his plan was to address the increasing threats faced by wildlife due to climate change. Officer Hayes worked closely with climate scientists and conservationists to better understand the ways in which environmental shifts were affecting animals' habitats and survival. He then began developing public outreach programs to inform communities about the link between climate change and wildlife decline. His goal was to bridge the gap between the public's understanding of climate issues and their willingness to take action. The response to these new outreach programs was overwhelmingly positive. Communities began adopting more eco-friendly practices, from reducing waste and conserving water to advocating for stronger climate policies. Officer Hayes was particularly proud of the young people who became involved in the movement, as they had the energy and determination to push for change in their communities. He knew that their commitment to sustainability would have lasting effects on the environment and the creatures that called it home. Officer Hayes felt that, in his own small way, He was helping to shape a brighter future for wildlife. As Officer Hayes' work continued to gain recognition, he was invited to collaborate on a groundbreaking project with a major wildlife documentary filmmaker. This film would focus on the importance of protecting wildlife and the human efforts to do so. Officer Hayes would serve as both a consultant and an on-screen guide, sharing his experience and expertise throughout the production. The documentary would showcase real-life wildlife rescues, including several animals Officer Hayes had personally saved, as well as highlight the role of communities in wildlife protection. Filming the documentary was a deeply moving experience for Officer Hayes. He had the opportunity to revisit some of his most memorable rescues, including the poor squirrel who had first brought him into the world of wildlife protection. The film crew captured the emotional moments of these rescues, showing the bond between humans and animals and the efforts made to ensure the survival of endangered species. The documentary went on to become a worldwide success, winning several prestigious awards and being featured in film festivals around the globe. Officer Hayes was grateful for the opportunity to spread his message to even more people, inspiring countless others to join the fight for wildlife preservation. Following the success of the documentary, Officer Hayes was approached by several international organizations to create a global wildlife rescue network. These organizations recognized his expertise and leadership and believed that his vision could be implemented on a much larger scale. Officer Hayes was thrilled by the idea, but knew that the project would require significant planning, coordination, and resources. However, he was determined to make it happen, believing that the world's wildlife deserved the same level of attention and protection that animals in his community had received. The process of building the global network was slow, but steady. Officer Hayes worked tirelessly to bring together experts from around the world, including veterinarians, conservationists, law enforcement officers, and volunteers. Together, they developed a comprehensive strategy for handling wildlife rescues, coordinating efforts across borders, and sharing resources and knowledge. By leveraging technology, they created a central hub where people could report wildlife emergencies and get in touch with trained professionals. This global network would become an invaluable resource for both individuals and organizations working to save animals in need. Officer Hayes' commitment to wildlife rescue was also reflected in his personal life. He had begun to think about the legacy he wanted to leave behind, both for his community and for future generations. After much consideration, he decided to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting wildlife conservation and rescue efforts. The foundation would offer grants to small local organizations, fund education programs, and provide resources for animal care and rehabilitation. It would also serve as a central point for connecting volunteers with wildlife rescue opportunities. The creation of the foundation was an emotional milestone for Officer Hayes. It represented the culmination of years of hard work, dedication, and passion for animals. As he reflected on his journey, from saving the squirrel to launching national campaigns and creating global networks, he felt a deep sense of pride. The foundation became a platform for others to get involved in wildlife protection, and its impact grew exponentially. Officer Hayes knew that the foundation would continue to grow, helping animals for many years to come, even after he had stepped back from the front lines of the rescue efforts. Officer Hayes' dedication to his cause was recognized by local and international leaders. In a ceremony attended by dignitaries and conservation advocates, he was awarded the prestigious Wildlife Champion Award for his outstanding contributions to the preservation of wildlife. The award recognized his tireless efforts to protect endangered species, build rescue networks, and inspire others to take action. Officer Hayes was humbled by the recognition but made sure to emphasize that he was just one person in a much larger movement. He shared the stage with other unsung heroes who had dedicated their lives to wildlife conservation. The ceremony marked the beginning of a new chapter for Officer Hayes. As he received the award, he knew that the work wasn't over. His mission had always been about creating lasting change, and he was more committed than ever to ensuring that the world's wildlife received the protection it needed. With the support of his family, his community, and the many organizations he had helped build, Officer Hayes felt confident that he had done everything he could to make a difference. And yet, he knew there was always more work to be done. As Officer Hayes continued his advocacy for wildlife, he began to focus on a new challenge: the rise of illegal wildlife trafficking. While he had made great strides in rescuing animals from harm, he knew that preventing these animals from being taken in the first place was just as important. Partnering with federal agencies, wildlife organizations, and law enforcement around the world, he began to raise awareness about the devastating effects of illegal poaching and trafficking on wildlife populations. Officer Hayes helped create specialized training for officers to detect and investigate wildlife trafficking operations. He also pushed for stronger laws and penalties for those involved in the illegal wildlife trade. His work on this issue gained significant traction, and within a few years, there was a noticeable decrease in wildlife trafficking activity in areas where Hayes and his team had focused their efforts. This victory represented a major milestone in his ongoing mission to protect animals from harm. With his success in fighting illegal wildlife trafficking, Officer Hayes found himself invited to international conferences on wildlife protection. These conferences gathered the world's top experts in conservation, law enforcement, and animal welfare, offering a unique opportunity for collaboration. Officer Hayes saw these conferences as a platform for sharing his knowledge and learning from others in the field. He eagerly attended, offering his insights into successful rescue operations and how communities could be empowered to take an active role in protecting wildlife. At one such conference, Officer Hayes was able to meet representatives from some of the world's most prominent wildlife organizations. He formed new partnerships, collaborating with these groups to launch joint rescue missions in regions facing the greatest threats to wildlife. Officer Hayes also took part in workshops designed to educate the public about the importance of preserving biodiversity and how everyone could contribute to wildlife protection efforts. The global connections he made at these conferences helped expand his reach and influence, furthering the impact of his work. During one of these conferences, Officer Hayes was introduced to a groundbreaking new technology designed to track and monitor wildlife populations. This innovative system used satellite imagery and drones to provide real-time data on animal movements, helping researchers and conservationists track species that were difficult to monitor. The technology had the potential to revolutionize the way conservationists understood and protected wildlife habitats, and Hayes was immediately intrigued by its possibilities. Recognizing the potential of this technology to aid in his rescue missions, Officer Hayes worked to integrate it into his global wildlife network. By deploying drones and using satellite data, he was able to gain valuable insights into areas where wildlife was in danger. This information allowed his team to respond quickly to emergencies, rescuing animals before they were caught in harmful situations. The technology also helped predict migration patterns and identify critical habitats that needed protection. Hayes' use of this cutting-edge technology marked a new chapter in his efforts to safeguard wildlife on a global scale. As Officer Hayes' network of wildlife rescuers grew, he began to see the real power of community involvement. While his own efforts were instrumental, he realized that true success depended on the collaboration of thousands of individuals working together. To foster this sense of community, Officer Hayes established local wildlife rescue chapters, where volunteers could receive training and become certified rescuers. These chapters served as hubs of knowledge and action, allowing people to become hands-on participants in the rescue and rehabilitation of animals in need. The local chapters became a central part of the wildlife protection movement, attracting volunteers of all ages and backgrounds. Some individuals had no previous experience with wildlife, but they were eager to help. Hayes provided comprehensive training programs that covered everything from basic animal care to more advanced techniques in rescuing injured or sick animals. Through these chapters, communities not only saved animals but also developed a deeper connection with the natural world. Officer Hayes was pleased to see the movement expanding, with local chapters thriving in cities and rural areas alike. Throughout his journey, Officer Hayes had the support of his family, who had always been his rock. His wife, Emily, and their 2 children, Luke and Mia, had been with him every step of the way. Emily shared his passion for wildlife and often volunteered alongside him, helping with various aspects of the rescue efforts. Luke, the eldest, had grown up watching his father's work and had developed a keen interest in animal conservation. Mia, his youngest, often shared her love for animals by creating art and illustrations that raised awareness about endangered species. As his children grew older, they became increasingly involved in the mission. Luke began working with the local wildlife rescue chapters, using his skills in technology to assist with drone operations and data analysis. Mia's artwork was featured in educational materials and social media campaigns that promoted the importance of protecting wildlife. Officer Hayes was proud to see his children carrying on his work, knowing that his legacy of conservation would live on through them. Their shared commitment to wildlife protection brought their family even closer together. As the years went by, Officer Hayes felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that his work had made a lasting impact on both his community and the world. The Global Wildlife Rescue Network continued to thrive, and the Rescue for All's campaign had become a permanent fixture in the animal welfare landscape. More animals were being saved, and more people were aware of the importance of wildlife conservation. Officer Hayes knew that the fight was far from over, but he had seen firsthand how far the movement had come, and he was confident that the future held even greater possibilities for protecting wildlife. As he prepared to retire from active service, Officer Hayes was content in the knowledge that he had dedicated his life to something meaningful. He handed over the reins of the rescue network to the next generation of conservationists, knowing that the work would continue without him. However, his involvement in wildlife rescue would never truly end. He planned to continue advocating for wildlife from behind the scenes, offering his expertise and support to the next wave of rescuers. Officer Hayes' journey had begun with a single squirrel, but it had grown into a global movement that would inspire generations to come.